Hello everybody and welcome to Photoshop 101 for the Vinyl Crafter. This is a special Photoshop tutorial video series geared specifically to people who have a Cricut or a Silhouette Cameo or a Brother Scan & Cut and want to use Photoshop to create their designs. I use Photoshop exclusively for my design work. I use Cricut's Design Space only to import my Photoshop designs and send to the cutter. I don't mess around with that software. It's buggy, it's glitchy, it's difficult to use, and I don't always get the result that I want. So I find it's a lot easier to design everything in Photoshop and then just save it as a transparent PNG file and send it to Cricut for cutting. And we're gonna go over that a little bit later. But first, there are a couple of things I want to talk about with Photoshop. Right now, I'm using version CS6, which is slightly older. Your version might be newer, might be older. It doesn't matter. We're not going to be going into a lot of in-depth details into the real blood and guts of Photoshop where the changes are significant between the versions. Adobe's rather, has been very good about continuity of their features. Throughout the versions, everything pretty much looks and feels the same. They have the same keyboard shortcuts, the same naming conventions. So no matter what version of Photoshop you're using, you should not have any problem following my tutorials because we're going to stay at the basic level. So fear not. If you have a different version of Photoshop than I do, don't worry about it. You're not going to have any problems. Couple other things I want to note before we dive in is I'm using a Windows version of Photoshop. So I talk about keyboard shortcuts a lot. They are very important in Photoshop. I always have one hand on my keyboard and one hand on my mouse. And as long as you're open, even if you don't typically use keyboard shortcuts, if you stay open-minded about them, you will find that you will learn them over time automatically, and they will speed up your work. They'll make you a lot more efficient when you're inside of Photoshop. So when I talk about keyboard shortcuts, because I'm in Windows, I'll say Control and Alt. And if you're on a Mac, you should know by now that Control means Command and Alt means Option, and just follow along accordingly as far as that goes. Another thing that I'd like to say is I do have a Cricut, so I do use Design Space. So you'll hear me say Cricut and Design Space a lot, and I'll tend to exclude the other models in their software. Just know that I'm not excluding them. If I say Design Space and you have a Cameo, it applies to you equally. I'm just calling it Design Space because it's quicker and easier for me. So we're going to dive right into Photoshop, and we're going to start at the very basic level and cover just a few of the basic tools. We're going to cover the layer panels, and we're going to cover transparency and solid backgrounds and how that impacts you as a vinyl designer. And we're going to start by creating a new blank image by clicking File and New, and the keyboard shortcut is Control-N. And I'm going to give this a name. You'll see the name that's listed right now is Untitled 1. We're going to call it Blue Lines, and you'll see why in a minute. You can change the width and height and the measurement standard from pixels to inches to centimeters. If you are designing something that has to be a very precise size and you want to use inches, Photoshop will be precise. And as long as the image you import into Design Space is 100% in proportion, you will get extremely precise cuts. So if you're afraid to use Photoshop because of the sizing issue, don't be. If you specify something to be 3 inches in Photoshop, it will end up 3 inches on vinyl, believe me. But for this demonstration purpose, we're just going to keep it at pixels. Resolution is also very important. I've got it set at 150. I would not go any lower for vinyl purposes. And I'll even go as high as 300 sometimes when I want cuts to be very, very clean and precise. And if you've ever fed a bad image to your Cricut or your Cameo, and while it's cutting, it sounds like a machine gun going off, that's because it's trying to recreate the pixel edges. The image you sent was so bad, it actually thinks that a round side is comprised of little square corners, and it's trying to recreate that. And the reason why is because the resolution on that image was too low. So you can avoid those problems by setting this to 150 or 200 or higher, and it will give you the clean, crisp images that your machine needs to cut clean, crisp lines. The color mode, I'm not going to get into this a lot, but just know that if you stay on RGB color mode, that's pretty much the preferred color mode for the work that you're going to be doing. RGB, that's red, green, blue, that's meant for screen colors, as opposed to CMYK, which is if you were sending something to a printer, you'd use a CMYK color model. But we're going to stick with RGB. And background contents are also very important, and we will talk about that briefly in this video between white and transparent and a solid background color. But we're going to start off, typically I do transparent, but for this education, we're going to start off with a white background. And you can completely ignore the advanced drop-down, by the way. So we're going to click OK, and it created a new image. And where I typed blue lines before, where it said Untitled 1, you will end up having multiple images open. So if I were to create another new image identical to that one, you'll see that's called Untitled 1. And you end up with a bunch of Untitled 1, Untitled 2, Untitled 3, and it becomes cumbersome to have to store that mental catalog of what image is in which untitled file. So if you get in the habit now of creating short, meaningful names, it will help you organize your workspace and work more efficiently. So we ended up with a white blank image of 400 by 900 pixels, and that translated into a white background layer that is locked by default. Everything you do in Photoshop is based on layers. Everything needs at least one layer. And we will talk about that before the end of this video. But you'll see that this layer is locked, so there's not much I can do. I can't put anything underneath it. I can't turn the layer off. So we have to unlock it first. And you unlock it by double-clicking on that icon and click OK. And now that layer is unlocked. That little lock icon went away. If I were to create another new layer, which is down here where it says create new layer, that's the little white piece of paper next to the trash can, I can create a layer simply by clicking this, or I can come up here to the layer menu and click on new layer, which has its own keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-N, and that allows, I want you to think of layers like pieces of glass, panes of glass that are stacked one on top of the other. This white layer is a piece of glass that's been painted solid white. And the new layer that we just put on top of it is clear. And you know it's clear because it's got that gray and white checkerboard background. If I hide this white layer by clicking on the eyeball, which I want you to think of that as removing that pane of glass from our stack, you'll see that that gray and white background appears over here. And that indicates universally, but mostly in Adobe products, transparency. Transparency is very important for vinyl craft work, and it will help you out immensely when you're trying to send designs to Design Space for cutting. Now, because we have we've hidden that layer, that white layer, and because we already have a layer that's transparent, I'm going to come over here to our paintbrush tool, which looks like a little paintbrush, and it has its own keyboard shortcut, which is B. All of these tools have letters in parentheses next to their names, and if you hover over any of these buttons, it'll tell you what the tool is and what its keyboard shortcut is. But right now we're on the Move tool. If I were to hit B on my keyboard, it changes over to my paintbrush tool. And the paintbrush tool, the color, if I were to click it right now, it would freehand paint a color the size of that circle on this layer. And that color is red right now. We're going to change that to blue because I already called it blue lines. And you'll notice that if I click that palette, it brought up my color picker. And you can select your hue and select your shade. Click OK. And that sets your foreground color. The box behind it is the background color. Don't worry about that right now. Just focus on the foreground color, which we changed to blue. So I'm going to start drawing a couple of freehand lines. Fair warning, they're not going to look pretty right now. And that's the paintbrush tool. That's the freehand paintbrush tool. Like I said, not pretty, but it's on that solid glass layer. So you know already that the gray and white checkered background indicates transparency, and that's fine, and it's very important. But sometimes when you're working with designs, like if we were to go to a black design, and if I were to change the size of this brush, which you can do by right-clicking the paintbrush tool, if I were to make that really small, if you're working with a couple of edges and intricate designs like flourishes, it can be a little difficult sometimes to see the image. Sometimes that gray and white checkerboard background interferes. So that's why I like having that white layer that I can hide and turn off. It's a visual aid. That white layer is nothing more than a visual aid for me as a vinyl crafter. And the reason why is if I were to save this file right now, and I'm going to save that, I'm going to pause and save that, so please hold. Okay, if I were to save that as a PNG file right now, I just brought that saved file into Cricut's design space. And you can see the white background. I click on Simple and click Continue. This is where I could select and erase that white background, which can get difficult, and it's a lot of extra work for you that's not necessary. But if I were to continue right now, look what it makes for a cut image. That whole white background, you have to remove that background in design space, or you're just going to be cutting one giant box. We don't want that. So before you save your Final Cut image, you turn that white background layer off and then save it again. And this time I'm going to save, then pause. There we go. Now you'll notice that white border is gone. When I click on Simple and Continue Now in Design Space, there is nothing to erase. And the cut image is automatically determined by Cricut for us. So that's why transparency is very, very important. So you balance between having that white background layer for a visual aid while you're designing, but remembering to turn it off before sending it to Cricut. And that also helps you understand layers a little bit more. Sticking with our notion that layers are like panes of glass, we're going to come in here and create another new layer, and we're going to switch colors to red. And this time we're going to make a few red lines. And I know this is just a garbage image. I'm just doing this to show you the importance of layers. If I were to grab this layer and move it, the blue layer, on top of the red layer, it changes the image. Just like putting paint on a glass and then moving the glass around, the same is true with layers. The topmost layer filters down to the bottommost layer. So if I were to take the white background and move it in between these two, it would completely hide the red layer, and we're left with just the blue. Likewise, if I were to move this on top of everything and then switch to our eraser tool, which is E, and start erasing, it's like a scratch-off ticket. It'll slowly start revealing the design underneath. And the reason why is because this layer is on top of the other two layers. If I were to move it back to the middle, it would not affect anything on the blue layer. It would only start exposing the red layer. And we move it back down to its rightful place on the bottom, and it doesn't matter what we erase, it's not going to affect either of the two layers on top. So it is like having multiple pieces of glass stacked on top of each other, and the order is important. It's very, very important that you remember this about layers, because it will become the foundation of everything that you do in Photoshop. All right, so we're going to go back to just our plain, untouched white layer, and we're going to create another new transparent layer on top of it. And keeping in with our blue lines name, we're going to come over to our paintbrush tool, reduce the size a little bit. Once again, I got to that size menu by right-clicking the paintbrush tool. And we're going to draw a few blue lines. There we go. This is really the only gotcha that Photoshop has by default that kind of throws off new users and drives people crazy. And that is their undo feature. In most applications, when you click Control Z, and that is the universal keyboard shortcut for undo, when you click Control Z, it undoes the last thing that you did. In this case, the last blue line that I draw, and it worked. And now you would think that if you kept hitting Control Z, it would go backwards in reverse order and undo everything that you did. So let's hit Control Z one more time, and look at that, the blue line is back. And the reason why is because Adobe kind of takes the word undo literally. So this first blue line that you drew, when you hit Control Z to undo it, it says, okay, you want to undo drawing that blue line. And the next thing that you want to undo is, well, the next thing that Adobe thinks you want to undo is undo your undoing, if that makes any sense. So it's more of a state change undo, and you can hit Control Z over and over again. You're just going to be playing back and forth between those two. And that's really inconvenient and really frustrating and annoying, especially for new Photoshop users, because they want that history. When you're drawing things, you make a lot of little changes, and you want to be able to go back in time and undo those changes back to a certain point. Adobe does offer a way to do that, and it's called the step backward feature, and that is very similar to undo, Control-Alt-Z this time. So if I hit Control-Alt-Z, we do get that history effect. But that is annoying for some people. Some people adapt. They say, yeah, sure, okay, I'll use Control-Alt-Z, and it's fine. And if you're that person, that's fine too. But Adobe does give you almost total control of their software, and you can change those keyboard shortcuts. So I like to swap those two. That's one of the first things I do when I install a new version of Photoshop is I'll click on the Edit menu and come down to Keyboard Shortcuts, and I'll click on the Edit menu, and there they are, Control-Z and Alt-Control-Z. And you can change them simply by highlighting it, and you'll see that it turns into a white box with selected text. And if I come down to step backwards, which is what we think undo is, the one with the history, and hit Control-Z, it'll give us a warning. It'll tell us that it's already in use. And if we click Accept, it will remove that keyboard shortcut from where it was previously assigned. So step backwards is now Control-Z, like it should be. And undo, we can now assign to Control-Alt-Z and click Accept. So we basically just effectively reversed those two shortcuts. So click OK. And now when we hit Control-Z, we have that undo feature that we know and love so well. That's really the only hang-up that comes with Adobe by default that I felt I should warn you about. And if you're that type of person that likes Control-Z to be that undo history, you now know how to change it. So before we end this episode, I would like to talk about a couple of these tools here. The first is the Move tool. And the Move tool is very important because what it does is it moves that layer of glass around. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to go back to the brush tool, and I'm going to make a blue design. And then I'm going to add another layer, come back to the color palette and change that to red so we have some contrast. And I'm going to make another design. So we now have a solid white layer, which is our base layer, our background layer. Above that, we have a piece of glass that's painted blue, and above that, we have a piece of glass that's painted red. If we switch over to our Move tool, which is V, and I select that blue layer, and I click and drag that design, I can move just that layer around. Now you saw me click the design, but really if I click anywhere on the layer, it moves the whole sheet of glass, to stick with our analogy. Let me show you what I mean. Go back to the brush tool, and I'm going to create Let's change those colors. By the way, if you want to change colors easily, there is a tool for that called the eyedropper tool. If you click that and select a color, it puts that in your primary palette. And that's cool. But you don't need that. If we are working with our move tool and suddenly we switch to our brush tool by hitting B, and you'll notice the mistake I just made by creating a red line on my blue palette. We say, uh-oh, we don't like that. That's going to get confusing. Let's undo that. We want to select that blue, but we don't have to go all the way over to the eyedropper and then select the color and then go all the way back to our brush. While we're inside of our brush, this is what I mean by keyboard shortcuts coming in handy. If I push and hold the Alt key, or Option on a Mac, it turns into an eyedropper, and I'm able to select whatever color I want. In this case, that same shade of blue, and it changes it in our palette. I let go of the Alt key to come back to brush, and now I can make a few dots on that same blue layer, that same blue sheet of glass. So if I go back to my move tool, which is V, and I grab that layer, it moves the whole layer and all of its designs around. If I grab the red layer, it does the same thing. It just shifts that glass around. That is an important distinction when you're working with layers, and it's also important to remember what layer you're working on. The layer that's highlighted is the layer that's going to be the recipient of whatever you do. So if I'm on the red layer with a blue brush, and you already have a blue layer, things can get confusing because that blue paint is now part of that red layer. And sometimes when people are working on designs and they're multi-layer designs and they forget which layer they're on, it can cause a lot of frustration and a lot of problems, especially when you do what I just did and you have these two primary colors spread over two layers. You switch to an eraser tool, which removes things from the layer, by the way. If I were to, because I'm on the red layer, which has blue paint, and I know it's getting confusing and I apologize, but if I start erasing that blue paint, it works because I'm on that layer. But if I try to erase this blue dot, it doesn't work because that blue dot is part of the blue layer, which I'm not working on. This layer is selected, so this layer gets the erases. The layer below it does not. That's one of those things about Photoshop that you have to wrap your mind around, you have to get used to, and it drives new users absolutely up the wall. But it's a very simple concept, a very simple theory, and once you get used to it and it all makes sense to you, Photoshop is very easy to use. Turn those two layers off, and with that, I will end this particular lesson. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned. I hope it was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.